Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Caddyshack project this morning to talk all things sexual health and young people in out-of-home care. I would like to begin today's session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we work, meet, and live. For me today, I am sitting on the beautiful Yuin country of the south coast of New South Wales, land of the Wadi Wadi and Wandandian peoples. As we meet in our space today and share our learnings, may we remember the learnings that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people bring and share with us. We would like to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and as I mentioned, encourage you to let us know which Aboriginal land, nation, or country you're joining us from today in the chat box. Thanks for being online with us. I've got some tech help in the background. So I've got Jen and Maddie from Caddyshack Project joining me this morning. Maddie's doing the slides. So if there is a slight delay, that's why. Thanks so much, Maddie and Jen, for being on here with me this morning. So let's start. Mary Poppins was famously quoted as saying, "Let's start at the very beginning. What a very good place to start." The trouble is, I haven't quite figured out the beginning of this story yet. I really struggle to think, how is it that we can serve justice to the young people who we'll be speaking about today? Straight up, I will state that I'm not an expert in trauma-informed practice, nor do I work specifically in the out-of-home care system, like many of you who are joining us today do. I have, however, been the co-lead on the out-of-home care Play Safe program for New South Wales Sexual Health for the past 4 years. It is in this role that my interest and passion for this area has expanded. And whilst I present to you today in my health role, I will be drawing on nearly 14 years experience as a sexual health promotion officer, also drawing on past experience as a sexual health counsellor, and drawing on my other career roles, which include being a case convener for juvenile justice, a consultant in sexual health for people with a disability, and more recently as a student support officer working with Aboriginal students in the Port Macquarie area who are in adult education. If you've joined us for Caddyshack training in the past, today may feel very different for you. Think of this, if you like, as a visual podcast. We invite you to grab a cuppa, get comfortable, and relax as we learn together for the next 55 minutes. I have a lot to say today, and I feel that that's what passion does to you. At times, I will be referring to my notes or my transcript if you like, and these notes and transcript will be shared with you after today's session, just because some of what we're talking about will be complex, and it may be some technical terms that some of you may or may have not heard of before. So these notes will be sent out after the session to further guide your learning. Some of these concepts, as I said, will be brushed over quickly. And for this reason, we have used and included hyperlinks in the transcript as well, so that if anything of interest stands out for you particularly, you're able to click straight through to those references and find out more. Unfortunately, it's unlikely there will be time to deal with questions today, certainly not in a manner that the questions will deserve. For this reason, we invite you to send us any questions that you may have directly via email. My email will come up at the end of the presentation, and you obviously have Jen's email from your registration as well. So we do welcome any questions via email. We will, however, have time throughout the session, and I encourage you to think about this right from the start, is to reflect on your own experiences and practices and use the chat box as a safe space to feel you can share some of those experiences and reflections. And as I said, I'll ask you for some of those throughout the session as we pause to reflect. Next slide, please, Matt. It would be really remiss of me to go into today's session and to move forward without first discussing self-care. For a long time, self-care has been thought of as bubble baths, massages, walks on the beach. And yes, all of this does define self-care and are beautiful things that you can do for yourself. However, we need to think about self-care more in our daily practices at work. What is it that we can do to take a moment to pause, to reflect, This might look like something going on a walk at lunchtime, being able to take some time out between each client to be able to reflect on how you're feeling after having seen the previous client. Also thinking about your own professional development and building skill in the area and having this worked into your daily practice. Regardless of what hat we are wearing today, and for some of us that is many, I think it's really fair to acknowledge that the times we're living in at the moment are quite challenging, and it's really necessary for us to give ourselves some extra love right now. Self-care is by no means selfish, it is essential. And in the work that we're doing, I really think we need to think about self-care in the sense of work health and safety. How is it that we can effectively offer care and care for others if we first haven't cared for ourselves? Mim Fox and Liz Murphy are two social workers who explore this notion of self-care in the workplace as part of their podcast series, The Social Work Stories. They also address the work of Brené Brown, a fantastic motivational speaker who famously quotes, "Maybe stories are data, but with a soul," something that may resonate with you as we move throughout today's session. Today is a safe online space. However, some of what is discussed may hit a little close to home or be confronting for some. We ask that throughout today's presentation, you listen to your body and your feelings, that you take a moment to pause if you need to and listen to your body, reaching out to loved ones if you need to, out to colleagues, to managers to discuss how you're feeling. And please, most of all, remember that you're all doing a great job. Debriefing is also a really important part of the work in which we do. Reach out to friends and your colleagues, reach out to caseworkers or your support network. And what I'd like you to do now is take a moment just to think about how it is you'll practice self-care for yourself after today's session. Thanks, Maddie. Next slide, please. We here at the Caddyshack Project position ourselves as believers and encouragers of young people who, through no fault of their own, have often found themselves in adverse situations which can then place them into the out-of-home care system. We are strong advocates for education and empowerment. That is, we believe that everyone is entitled to education and support around their sexual health and their reproductive needs, regardless of their past experiences. We acknowledge the harmful and often devastating effects that trauma can have on young people. We recognise the negative language that is often associated with trauma and the need for therapy and healing. We do not underplay the severity of trauma in the development of young people's brains, nor their ability to process life moving forward. We don't downplay anybody's experience of trauma. The beautiful Hilda Hinton, who is sister to the lovely Samuel Johnson from the Love Your Sister project, was recently stated as quoting, "Just because there are people out there worse off does not mean that we should belittle our own experience." And I think that's something important for us to all reflect on as we move forward. There are a wide range of events that can potentially cause trauma. Trauma can be caused by events that the individual doesn't even remember, such as events that occurred in early childhood, events that were necessary and essential, such as medical procedures, or an event that didn't even necessarily happen to the person, but happened to a group of people that he, she, or they identify closely with, such as slavery, the Holocaust, or the genocide of Indigenous people. Trauma can include a single incident. It can also include a secondary exposure or prolonged and repeated events. These experiences may also be intergenerational. We're also now learning a lot more about epigenetics, and that is the impact of the trauma experienced by our parents, particularly our mothers and grandmothers, then being passed on to us in our genes. Over time, we know that chronic stresses can also cause trauma, and we will learn about the experiences of young people and the stresses that they may be exposed to. It is with intention that we use a trauma-informed practice to broaden the current perspectives that we have when addressing the sexual health needs of young people in out-of-home care. Today, I will cover sexual health, trauma-informed practice, and out-of-home care as three separate entities. I will then try to weave the three concepts together to paint a broader picture for you. Think of me as the librarian, if you like, curating the information, packaging it up neatly, and sending you to more resources for further and detailed information and training. Today is purely an entree. There are plenty of fulfilling main meals out there. It's really designed to give you a taste and a passion, the same as we here at the Caddyshack Project have developed. We recognise that not everybody's experience of sexual health and relationships is positive. Indeed, many young people in the out-of-home care system have and will experience sexual abuse, coercion, or sexual violence. It is our goal to support these young people to reach a positive sexual sense of self through therapy and healing, despite past trauma that may have been experienced. We invite you to participate in these broader perspectives. By doing so, you are helping to guide and encourage the care and therapy required by these young people to go on to have positive sexual experiences in their lives, as is a human right. Good sexual health promotion is grounded in sex-positive frameworks. This means that sex is viewed as a positive force in people's lives, and it is hoped that even after sexual trauma, people can go on to have pleasurable and meaning sexual lives. All of us here today have a role to play in providing safe environments for young people to engage in these conversations. We also have a chance to role model positive and healthy relationships and offer safe places and spaces in which to explore young people's beliefs and values around sexual health and relationships. Often, it is this education and role modeling which is crucial to the young person's understanding, particularly of healthy relationships. At the end of the day, we only know what we know. If we have grown up knowing and experiencing family and domestic violence, it is likely that this is our reference for relationships. These are often considered unhealthy, and it's through education and empowerment that we can help show a young person indeed what a healthy relationship looks like. Young people need to learn healthy relationships versus unhealthy in all aspects of relationships and connections, not just in a romantic sense, but their relationships may have also been impacted with peers, friends, and family, particularly those in the out-of-home care system. I truly believe that young people in the out-of-home care system need to know that they deserve love, trust, and respect in healthy relationships and help them work towards achieving these. Sometimes those who have experienced trauma may act or behave in ways that are considered inappropriate or unfavourable by society. We need to view these behaviours as survival tactics. It's what the young person has come to learn as a method of survival. In taking a judgment-free approach when working with these young people, we address the young people as different, not broken, not wrong, not needing fixing, but purely different. The most important shift that we can make moving on from today is our narrative, our thoughts, and our behaviours or language around trauma. Instead of asking or thinking, what is wrong with you? I would now like you to consider asking or thinking, what has happened to you? Let's begin the conversation. I'm now going to move into setting the scene for young people in out-of-home care, talking about trauma-informed practice or care, and having a look at the definition of sexual health. So having a look at each of these as a separate entity before we move on to tie them all together. So young people being placed in care is not new. And in fact, the experiences of young people in out-of-home care have remained relatively unchanged. In 2020, there were 16,160 young people in New South Wales in out-of-home care. 41.4% of these young people identified as being either Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. It's unlikely that this number is a truly accurate number, as it doesn't take into consideration the informal care arrangements or kinship care that also occur. The Tune report, which was commenced in 2015 and released in 2018, started for the first time to shine a real light on the out-of-home care sector and the experiences of young people in out-of-home care. The Tune report looked at areas which were considered for change, including the way it was managed, that is the way the out-of-home care services were managed from a very business-like model, looking more towards proactive measures of care with young people as opposed to reactive measures, and focusing on things such as family support and restoration, hoping to restore the family unit and support the family as opposed to the removal of young people, and the importance of client-centered care, that is, the importance of the young person's journey for themselves when it came to what it was that their needs were and how they could be best addressed. There is no denying that young people in out-of-home care have witnessed higher rates of domestic and family violence, drug and alcohol misuse, and mental health. Many young people in out-of-home care have had adverse childhood experiences. You may have heard of these referred to as ACEs. An ACE is a stressful or traumatic event which is experienced in the first 18 years of life. According to Origin, who are a Victorian organisation leading the way in child health and wellbeing research, state that half to 2/3 of young people will have experienced a traumatic event or an adverse childhood experience by the time they're 16 years of age. An adverse childhood experience can include domestic and family violence, parental abandonment through separation or divorce, a parent or carer who misuses drugs, a parent or carer with a mental health condition, abuse, neglect, a parent or carer in prison, or a young person having to care for the parent or caregiver. These are just a few to name. So what do these experiences mean for the young person? Generally speaking, the experience of trauma in childhood leads to poorer outcomes in lots of elements across health, education, and well-being domains. It is often that these young people are seen to have complex needs. How do we address these complex needs? Next slide, please, Maddie. I would now like to move into setting the scene around trauma-informed. But when we talk about trauma-informed what? The language around trauma-informed practice, care, is so buzz right now, and the words are often used interchangeably. So what I'd like to do now is break those down a little bit just to give a general understanding of some of those terms which you may have heard and indeed what they're referring to. Firstly, I'd like to start by introducing trauma-informed care, or TIC as it's sometimes called. Trauma-informed care recognises that everybody has a story and that for many, trauma is a part of that. It also views the presenting concerns as symptoms of trauma. That is, the problems are the problem, the person is not the problem. So that helps when coming to address these things from a therapeutic point of view. The next term I'd like to introduce you to is trauma-informed framework. Trauma-informed frameworks have been taken on by many organisations and services now. There are many types of frameworks out there, and we do refer you to some in the follow-up email and as part of this transcript. There are many frameworks, however, essentially they do look at similar key features, and I will talk in detail over a framework in just a moment. Trauma-informed practice uses a strengths-based framework, which is then founded on the principles of trauma-informed care. And moving on to possibly the greater is having a trauma-informed service. That is that service in particular is trained and specialises in the treatment of trauma. And they very much work off the principles of first do no harm, and do not re-traumatize. Trauma-informed practice is a relatively new approach to therapeutic work, having had its roots in a medical system after the Vietnam War in the 1970s. In Australia, a lot of organisations and services have now moved to trauma-informed practices, and many have frameworks underpinning their organisational strategies and models. New South Wales Health have been working on a trauma-informed framework. This has been cited in draft, and it was hoped that we would be able to introduce you to this framework today. However, due to the current climate, this document has not been formally released. Once it is released, we will endeavour to have it sent out to all of you who have attended and registered for today. What we can say about the framework, though, having seen it, is that it does follow most typical models of trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed care. I'm now going to talk you through some of the models of trauma-informed practice that are out there, or some of the steps. Again, reminding you that this transcript and what I'm about to talk through will be provided to you after the session today, because some of this may seem detailed, complex, and a little hard to follow depending on where you're at in trauma-informed care and practice yourself. One of the first things to do is to have a think about where you or your service do sit in trauma-informed care or trauma-informed practice. The available literature suggests that there is a continuum of trauma-informed care or practice. That being that we seek to know information about trauma and the implications that it can have for individuals, community, and sometimes indeed our own organisations. To be trauma-informed, we really do need to see a cultural shift happening at a systemic level. Some services are there and working on this. Others have just started, and we encourage all services to start the journey around trauma-informed care. One useful resource that was adapted by Miesler and Myers in 2013 sets out the progression in 4 distinct stages. This resource can be accessed through the transcript, but generally speaking, we start off by being trauma aware. That is that we recognise that everybody has a story, and that sometimes, in a lot of cases even, trauma is a part of that. So we be trauma aware in having those conversations with people, and we seek out information about the trauma. Being trauma sensitive, particularly at an operational level, means having concepts of trauma embedded within the organisation's work practice. So the organisation may have taken on a trauma-informed framework and be starting to introduce trauma concepts when working with their clients. Being trauma responsive then, moving forward, means responding differently to how we would have responded before. We're actually now making changes in our organisation's behaviour or in our own individual behaviour that comes from a trauma-informed place. Finally, to becoming fully trauma-informed. I guess it's the peak of the mountain and what we're all aiming for. But at a trauma-informed stage from an organisational point of view, it means that the entire culture of the service or organisation has shifted to reflect a trauma-informed approach in all that they do across all settings and practices within their workplace. So something to keep striving and working towards. I would now like to step you through the stages of a trauma-informed framework that we have used as part of our out-of-home care resources within the Play Safe program. I will speak a little bit more about these resources in a moment. However, I just want to now talk through the points of the framework that we used when developing our trauma-informed fact sheet and our trauma-informed booklet. The reason why we chose this particular framework was that it was quite detailed. It does have 8 levels that I will speak through. However, most frameworks have approximately 5. The first, and without a doubt the most important, and the one consistent piece that is across all frameworks, is to ensure the environments that we're providing are safe. Safety needs to be the first thing that comes to our mind when we think about trauma-informed care and providing services. Having a physically and an emotionally safe environment lets the young person know that our service is a safe space. It gives the young person permission to open up and to talk with you, whilst also being mindful of any mandatory reporting requirements that you may have in your role. To me, having a safe and supported environment can be something in a therapeutical sense, as even typically we would have a therapy session in a room with a closed door. That may be very confronting for some young people, depending on their trauma experience. Perhaps if you could offer to have that therapeutic session outdoors, or to say, I would like to close over the door for your privacy and confidentiality. However, I can leave that open if that is your preference. Again, put the choice back onto the young person and let them control their own outcomes. The second point of the framework that we engaged was to share power with the young people, maximizing their choice and control. So very much, as I've just touched on, it's about educating and empowering the young people. For some of these young people, particularly those who have experienced trauma and in out-of-home care, a lot of choice and control is often taken from them. This is a way that we're able to put the ball back into their court and to allow them to make some of those choices and decisions for themselves. We know that through this empowerment and education, it leads to higher awareness within the young person. We're trying to work on increasing their self-esteem, and it gives them a higher sense of self-value, knowing that they have choice and control over situations. We also believe that choice and control are particularly important when it comes to sexual health, things like consent, for example, which we'll touch further on later. Point 3 of the framework is in providing training and education for practitioners about the impacts of trauma and developing safety and crisis plans. So in developing safety and crisis plans, I would suggest that this is not just for the young people who you're working with, but also for yourself. In prioritising trauma-informed training within staff, we are then able to focus on the impacts of trauma and take the time to plan and develop those safety and crisis plans. It is particularly important around education and professional development in the sphere of trauma-informed practice. And again, as part of our follow-up email and later today, we will touch on organisations or services that we recommend to follow up with in terms of professional development. Point 4 is to provide ongoing supervision and support to practitioners to help mitigate the impacts of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue, as some of you may know it. As touched on before as part of self-care, professional supervision is so crucial to the work that we are doing. Having discussions with management or supervisors as to the practice and experiences that you've been able to have, and how you're managing your own self-care are all particularly important when you're dealing with young people who have had experiences or been impacted by trauma. Don't worry, we'll be circling back to self-care before the session's out, don't you worry. Point 5, and I think this is something that's particularly important and one of the reasons why we chose this particular framework, because not all trauma-informed frameworks include this. However, it's providing a culturally safe and a gender-safe, gender-sensitive service. So the impact of culture in somebody's identity is important, and in some cases, it is the identity that has led to the experience of trauma. So we really saw value in including this point in our framework. Most services offer a culturally safe and gender-sensitive service. However, it's always a really good idea to revisit this. And one of the ways that you can do that is to get a hold of a culturally safe or gender sensitive service checklist and just do a run through about your service and your practice and to see if indeed it is as safe as you believe it to be. Things as simple as displaying posters of a welcoming nature of a diverse range of young people in your waiting spaces, ensuring that all staff are using appropriate languages and terms, such as pronouns for young people. Do they prefer to be referred to as he, she, or they? Whilst these may seem like really little things, they make a really big difference to young people when entering and approaching services. Point number 6 is ensuring that our communication is open and respectful. We think about those connections that we're able to form with young people And communication is one of the key parts of healthy relationships. So best we're able to model this is to give young people the open and respectful communication that they deserve. Being open and respectful with young people helps to develop trust and rapport. I think also in this that being honest with young people is so crucial and important. We need to be really mindful that we're not promising them anything that we know we cannot deliver. We don't want to set up expectations for the young person and then not to be able to deliver and give them a sense of failure or needs not being met again, because most of their life experience has been about those failed expectations being met. So we need to be very mindful of that, because that in and of itself could be a form of re-traumatization. I believe that when we're working with any young person, this is the 7th point, is that we're supporting what their goals and interests are. This helps with that safety and crisis plan as well, in the sense of if we're able to have them embedded and engaged, particularly in community, we can then think about what is it that's going to make them feel safest at those times of crisis. Engaging them in meaningful activities for them can bring a sense of joy, inclusion, and achievement. Factors that are so crucial and important for those young people who have experienced trauma, particularly those in out-of-home care. Activities that allow connection with other people may be beneficial, but we do need to be mindful that sometimes young people may also try to isolate themselves or push themselves away from others based on their past experiences. So again, we need to share the story with the young person, ask them what it is that they would like as part of their journey, and support those goals and interests moving forward. Finally, and certainly not lastly though, in terms of importance, is referring young people to trauma-specific services for therapy and care, or getting them into trauma-specific interventions. I suggest that you become familiar with the local services and organisations in your area who are now seen as specialists in trauma-informed practice. This may be trauma-based psychologists, sexual assault services, domestic and family violence services, or family and community services who have embedded themselves in trauma-informed practice. Trauma-informed care is not designed to directly improve any specific symptoms that are related to trauma exposure, but rather they're there to provide a service environment through policy at an organisational level that takes account of specific needs and the sensitivities of those who have experienced trauma. Rome wasn't built in a day, and your service won't take on trauma-informed care in a day either. There's lots of practice and work that's needed in this area. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, or SAMHSA as they're often referred to, have come up with the 4 R's of trauma-informed care, which is nicely packaged and a little easier to recall. These 4 R's are: first, we realise the widespread impact of trauma, and we understand potential paths for recovery. The second R is to recognise. We try to recognise signs and symptoms of trauma in clients and therefore work with them to address this. These signs or symptoms may also present in family members, staff of services, or indeed in some cases within community itself. The third R is to respond. So being fully integrated into knowledge about trauma-informed care and practice, we're better able to respond. That is, we've set up policies, procedures and practices within our own areas of work, our own services or organisations, which allows us then to respond to the trauma of the clients who are presenting to us. The fourth and final R, and one that we cannot ever undervalue enough, is the resist re-traumatization. So first, do no harm in any of the work that we do. This is particularly important of children, but also of adult trauma survivors, thinking also about the families and other people who may have been affected by those traumas. Next slide, please, Maddie. That was a lot to get through, wasn't it? I bet you're glad I'm sending out the transcript so you can reflect on some of that later. I would now just like to touch on what it is the trauma experience actually includes, involves, or may present. I think it's really important for us to have an understanding of that trauma experience before we can think about moving forward with the work that's happening with young people. So as mentioned earlier, most young people experience at least one traumatic event before the age of 16. Trauma impacts on us all differently though, and we've seen that as results of traumatic events that have happened throughout history. Even those who haven't been a part of the actual trauma have felt trauma responses long after the event. Our response to and the effect of trauma will vary largely depending on our own past experiences, our learned experiences, and our levels of resilience. It also depends on how safe and connected it is that we feel after that trauma experience has occurred. Young people who are more at risk of experiencing trauma include children and young people in out-of-home care, young people in the justice system, young refugees or those as part of the humanitarian project, young people who identify as sexually and or gender diverse, young people who identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and also homeless young people. Next slide, please, Mads. So whilst the trauma experience can be varied, so too can the impacts of trauma. Trauma can have a devastating effect on the trajectory of a young person's life. Everything is affected, from their physical health to their mental health, their emotional health, their well-being, and their ability to process emotionally and understand their sense of self-worth, whilst also affecting their behaviours and often their abilities to develop healthy, meaningful relationships. The mental health impacts of trauma are quite diverse and need to be considered as well. These impacts can include, but are certainly not limited to, alcohol and substance abuse disorders, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, psychosis, personality disorders, and self-harm and suicide-related behaviours. According to Origin, trauma, which is experienced especially in childhood, significantly impacts brain development. The trauma and its response impacts core neural functions, which can then later lead to impaired cognitive abilities. This is sometimes why we see people in out-of-home care as being said to have a lower cognitive, stage, potentially for their age. Feeling threatened in childhood, particularly from a person who's supposed to be caring for us, leaves the brain stranded between survival reflex and attachment. This diverts attention from other developmental tasks, such as learning. This can also leave the individual in a high state of alert and more likely to be easily distressed by minor disruptions. Imagine, if you will, the brain is constantly in flight, fight, freeze, or fawn mode. Flight being that one runs away from the situation, fight being that they stand their ground and take whatever is in front of them, freeze being that they stand still and pretend as though they are not there, and fawning being that they show a nicety to the situation and they try to kill the situation with kindness, a very new approach that we're just now learning about. This is where trauma-informed care becomes a useful tool when engaging with young people. The third and final part of this touching of the icebergs of the three important topics we're addressing today is sexual health. According to the current working definition from the World Health Organization, you might just want to pop the slide up for me, Mads. Thanks. Sexual health is defined as a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to sexuality. It's not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction, or infirmity. Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, which are free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. For sexual health to be attained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. For those who have experienced trauma, particularly that which included an incident of a sexual nature, it can be difficult to achieve this definition of sexual health. Reasons for this will be explored and ways to work on moving forward will be identified as we proceed in the following sections of this presentation. This now concludes touching on what is just the tip of the icebergs of out-of-home care, trauma-informed care, and sexual health. Before moving forward and trying to tie these concepts together, I'd like you to take a moment to pause. Please reflect on any feedback or reflections that you've had in the last half hour. And if you feel safe to share, please put some of those reflections or those experiences into the chat box. I'm a big believer in the fact that we learn so much from other people's experience, as we're about to learn moving into this next section. So please don't hesitate to drop them into the chat box if you feel safe to do so. Moving forward, what are some of the barriers that young people, particularly in out-of-home care, may face around disclosing experiences of trauma or working within sexual health? So young people who have experienced trauma face significant barriers to seeking help or disclosing the trauma. Many young people may not disclose the trauma they experience for a variety of reasons, some including they feel that they'll be unable to cope with the consequences of disclosure. Prior disclosure for them may have been what led to police action or removal from family. They know the consequences, so sometimes they won't disclose or ask for help because they're fearful of what those consequences may be. They may have difficulty remembering the trauma experience, or they may not remember the trauma experience specifically. They are minimizing or not understanding the impact that trauma is having on them, and this will depend on age and stage development as well. They may feel deeply ashamed or embarrassed about the experience, or they may have difficulty verbalizing their trauma and fear that some people won't believe them. When I've worked with young people who have experienced this, I say to them they always need to keep talking until they do find that person who believes them. Many young people in out-of-home care have missed educational opportunities around sexual health and relationships. Often this is due to transitioning through placements or not engaging with the educational system at the time of delivery. Put simply, they have missed key educational milestones and information which they are entitled to hear. So as workers, caseworkers, carers, having a sexual health conversation with a young person in care can be difficult or may seem difficult. And there are some things that can present challenges to us as the carers or workers. These can include, but are not limited to, generational changes. So for example, I know that a lot of foster carers, they have already raised their own teenage children and they're not sure about how to have conversations with the teenagers or adolescents who are now in their care. Some things have changed, most notably access to the internet, which has then also changed discourse around things like pornography, for just one example. Often we have fear of re-traumatizing the young person. So when we take that framework or reference of first do no harm, we want to ensure that whatever discussions we have are not re-traumatizing. There's also a fear of grooming. Grooming being that it describes the preparation phase of a child sexual assault and exploitation, which is undertaken by the perpetrator to gain the trust of the child or the young person and to establish a sense of secrecy and silence. To help mitigate this fear, it is always advised that you discuss any intention to have the conversation with a young person about sexual or reproductive health with a case manager, particularly in an agency, to ensure that you're all on the same page. The Out-of-Home Care Play Safe program have developed an online training package which is targeted towards foster carers. This is, however, relevant to anybody who's interested in sexual health for young people, particularly young people in out-of-home care. The title of this training is Because You Care, Fostering Conversations about Sexual and Reproductive Health. The training is available free of charge via the Y Foundation's webpage, and links to that are provided as a follow-up. To develop this training, carers and caseworkers were consulted with, and based on the feedback, the Because You Care training package goes into depth on how to start and continue a sexual health and relationship discussion with young people in out-of-home care. From that training, I thought I would just introduce some points which may be useful, particularly for those of us on here today who are carers or working directly with young people in out-of-home care. The first being that we don't assume a young person's situation or their level of knowledge around sex and reproductive health. If they ask a question, we encourage them to ask them what it is that they already know. In asking this, we're not assuming any level of understanding. We're getting their response, and this will then help us to determine what it is that they do already know and to gauge their level of understanding. We talk about conversation starters, and one of the ways that you might like to start a conversation is by saying something like, it's around your age, that some young people may become interested in relationships and or sex. I'm not sure if you're in a relationship or you're interested in those things at the moment, but if you are, know that you can come and talk to me about that. Or if you don't feel comfortable talking to me, I can refer you to some relevant information or services. We often find that having a conversation with a young person in a car is a really useful strategy. Car talks are easier because you're side by side, not face to face. They're generally a nice amount of time to start a conversation around sexual health and relationships. And fortunately, most young people won't jump out of a moving car. So you do have a bit of a captive audience at that time. I also want to think about using the young person's interests and what they're into as a point of reference. Thinking about what kind of music they're into, what movies they like, or what TV shows they've been watching. You can use characters out of those TV shows or movies as a way to say, what do you think about what happened to ABC? What would you do if you're in the same situation as ABC? Have you and your friends ever been in a situation the same as ABC? And how did you respond or react? The most important thing is that you stick to fact, that you're open and honest with the young person, and you don't let the questioning become intrusive. That is, we don't ask questions just for the sake of curiosity. We provide information for the sake of educating and empowering. Next slide, please, Maddie. So tying the three together, we come back to sexual health, trauma-informed practice, and young people in out-of-home care. A trauma-informed approach for adolescent sexual health is a way of addressing vital information about sexuality and well-being for young people that takes into consideration adverse life experiences and their potential influence on sexual decision-making. The goal of such an approach is to prevent sexual harm, unplanned pregnancy, and or sexually transmissible infections and bloodborne viruses. No two people's response to trauma will be the same. So some things to be mindful of when discussing sexual health with young people are that we want them to be as safe as possible. Ideally, this means them being empowered and knowledgeable around sexual consent and safer sex, that is, sex with condoms or protection. Also realizing that sometimes a young person's trauma response is to form intimate sexual connections with other people. We need to be aware that sometimes this only provides a temporary fix to the impact of the trauma experience. Also noting that trauma is sometimes connected to dysregulation of behavior and emotion. This means that in some situations, a young person's judgment, self-confidence, and their ability to give, deny, or withdraw consent may be reduced. Engaging young people in ways that motivate them to heal unresolved pain and to maintain healthy relationships is important. These efforts require knowledge about trauma and a clearly defined and structured approach to sexual health and well-being. It's believed that no matter how a person has experienced sex in the past, that they can go on to have a healthy sexuality and sex life. When we view sexuality as a human right, as it is, we see the importance of engaging trauma survivors in therapies and offering them ongoing support to achieve a healthy sexuality and sex life. Next, please, Maddie. In this next session, I would now like to introduce you to some of the experiences that I've had with young people. I believe that in sharing some of these young people's stories will truly help us as workers to understand the impacts of trauma and indeed see that there is light after the dark. I've had the pleasure of working with young people throughout my whole career. I've seen young people who have experienced trauma and know that with appropriate therapies and counselling, healing is possible. We all have opportunities to grow and change, and that the voices and experience of young people in care should not be undervalued. There is so much that we can learn from these young people in terms of our own professional practice, but also in terms of our own care and compassion, both as professionals and individuals. The first scenario I'd like to share with you, we were recently at a community event where a young woman approached our table, confident, bubbly, and willing to engage with two middle-aged ladies. It was evident that our stall was about sexual health and women's health. Without prompting, she was soon to share with us her own experiences around sexual health, stating, "This is so important for everybody. I get regular sexual health checkups with my GP and I have Implanon. I want to know that I am free of disease and protected." Further discussions with this young woman led to us learning that she was 14 years of age. She was in the out-of-home care system, and she had been since she was a young child. In those 14 years, she'd had over 14 placements and lived in 4 different states. This young woman went off on her way with a smile with her friends. The other staff member and I looked at each other in absolute awe. The fact that she was so upbeat, positive, and confident despite her backstory. We only had 5 minutes with this young person. No doubt there was a bucket load of trauma that followed her, that there are dark days. However, it was really evident that with lots of support, and no doubt lots of therapeutic support, and a good GP who was receptive to conversations around sexual and reproductive health, that her needs and a for now solid and secure care arrangement were allowing her to heal and grow after trauma, and showed that such things are possible. It also highlighted the need for those sexual health conversations, GPs' willingness to discuss sexual and reproductive health concerns with young people, and the support of carers and caseworkers in her situation. Another story I'd like to share with you. I was recently reunited with a counselling client who I had had over 9 years ago. When I first met this young person, they had been taken into care after removal from an extremely traumatic environment. The carer had brought the young person to see me in my counselling role to provide some education around puberty and development. It very quickly became apparent to me that this young person's needs were better addressed with a sexual assault team as opposed to a sexual health team. The young person's cognitive age was probably 7 to 8 years below their birth age. Their language was minimal and their cognitive understanding severely impacted. The recent reunion was unplanned. I was asked to attend a service setting and provide some education and guidance to young adults with mild to moderate intellectual disability. The mannerisms of the young adult in the room seemed particularly familiar to me, though I couldn't place them. Different town, different context, and nearly a decade on. It wasn't until the car drive home that it hit me as to who the young person was and the context in which I had first met them. Without knowing it, a tear trickled down my face and dripped off my chin. My body was taken back to the time I had first met this young person. To see them alive, let alone thriving, was just such a special moment. Thirdly, working with juvenile justice means that I'm exposed to some of the most vulnerable young people in our community. The common theme that I see is young people who are lacking in self-esteem, often feeling abandoned and not worthy of love. They feel lost and lacking direction. Thankfully, the restorative justice process aims to connect these young people to community and to start engaging positively within their community. The biggest changes often come from the smallest acts of kindness, compassion, and most of all, a non-judgmental approach. I've seen all types of trauma and trauma responses in this role. It is in my genes to want to take these young people home with me, though I know, of course, I cannot. I work with these young people for a very short period of time, but I make sure that my time is about quality, not quantity. The hardest day of work in this role so far was when a young person in out-of-home care turned to me and said, "Why do you care so much?" And my initial thoughts were, "Why do you feel you deserve so little care?" We all have a story and we all have experiences. The way we process and handle it is different. And a quote which recently resonated with me quite heavily was, "Just because they carry it well doesn't mean it's not heavy." A very powerful thought for you to all consider. So how do we know if trauma is a factor? I suppose the question we need to ask is, do we need to know? I would use a trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed principles on everyone. With such high numbers of adverse childhood experiences in young people, it's very likely that the young people you're working with have had some experience of trauma. Trauma impacts individuals uniquely. There may be some telltale signs of trauma, like withdrawn attitudes, socially unaccepted behaviour, shy, softly spoken, and lacking in self-esteem. However, the opposite can also be true, with young people having a sense of entitlement, loud and sudden movements, attention seeking, and often risky behaviour. I've worked with young people who, through trauma, have developed severe psychosis. An example was following on from a vicious sexual assault, where the young person then heard the perpetrator's voice over and over, telling them to self-harm, and sadly they did, repeatedly. I now see this young person regularly in another town with the same best friend that they had over 15 years ago. Several children follow this young person, and she has the biggest smile that you ever did see. What I also see, though, are scars of a time when things were not as great for her, and unfortunately these scars cannot be removed. I'm taken back to a time when life was very different for them, but I'm glad that they have been able to move forward in their own special and significant ways. I've also seen several young women who present as very masculine in appearance. This was sometimes mistakenly taken as sexual diversity by workers or carers. However, often was the case where the presentation in masculine form was to avoid the attention of males, a form of self-preservation, if you like, following from the experience of a sexual assault. Sadly, we cannot know how it is that trauma will impact or present itself. What we can do is to take the time to listen to a young person's story, show unconditional positive regard and support. It is through this trauma-informed care that we can start to build positive relationships and connections that are built on trust, something which has often been missing in the lives of these young people. Trauma and sexual behaviours. Young people who have experienced trauma often become more vulnerable. This is because some young people may become involved in exploitative situations and relationships. These situations and relationships often come with a promise of something, be it food, accommodation, drugs, alcohol, affection, money. For some, it's just a sense of belonging and being needed. Vulnerable young people find themselves enticed to engage in these sexual activities for these reasons. Risk-taking in the form of unprotected sex may be more common, and therefore these young people are more likely to be impacted by sexually transmissible infections or unplanned pregnancy. Due to a history of sexual abuse, some people may feel numb to the experience of sex. Others may go into paid sex work, where they have a sense of control and power over the sex and relationship, something which had previously been taken away from them. For some, you may be familiar with the term problem sexual behaviour, or PSB. Problem sexual behaviour is sexual behaviour that falls outside of the typical development activity of children or young people. It can have detrimental impacts on the child engaging in the behaviour, as well as those around them who are targets of that behaviour, often other young children. It can also have a detrimental impact on family and friends. There are several common pathways for the development of problematic sexual behaviour in children and young people, such as trauma, neglect, abuse, developmental delays, behavioural problems, socioeconomic disadvantage, and exposure to family and domestic violence. Fortunately, however, these risk pathways lead to problematised sexual behaviour in a very small number of children who have been exposed. Family Planning Queensland have a wonderful resource which uses a traffic light system, green, amber, red, to identify sexual behaviours based on a young person's age and determine if it's normal developmental activity, if it's a cause for concern, amber, or if it's a cause of harm, in red. New Street is a specialised service provider who are available to provide specialist support and psychological treatment in the field of problematised sexual behaviour. There are several sites across New South Wales, and we've linked those into this resource for those of you needing it. What role do you play in this trauma-informed practice and moving into care with young people around their sexual health? First of all, you can provide guidance. You become the lighthouse, guiding the young person to shore. You throw the safety ring in to help them. You don't jump in yourself. As mentioned earlier, Brené Brown covers this work really well. Sometimes it's the difference between empathy and sympathy. The second thing that you can do is empower and educate, providing young people with the skills and knowledge required to navigate sexual health and relationships is extremely important, if not crucial. It will give you a sense of being able to walk beside the young person on their journey. Treatment. So that is that some of you may be placed off a specialised trauma treatment and services. If not, being able to refer. So again, being aware of those services in your area who are specialised in trauma treatment is particularly important, and knowing how to refer. Lastly, training. So that is attend your own training and professional development around trauma-informed practice. Thinking broadly about the experiences of young people can really help you too. Reflecting on the first 1,000 days of life being fundamental for lifelong growth, development, and nourishment. If you would like to think of a flower that's not thriving and surviving, we don't ask the plant to change. We change the environment so that the plant is able to grow and thrive. Perhaps if we thought the same way when working with young people, we would achieve better results, allowing them a chance to change their environment and to give them the best chance at life. The development of youth-friendly and focused models of mental health care, such as Headspace, has well positioned these services to operate according to principles identified within trauma. There is a move toward trauma-informed services and systems-informed care models. However, we need to really look at the improvement of the assessment and the treatment of trauma-related disorders. So what will you do after today? We're drawing to a close, and I'd like to thank you for bearing with me for this long. I do realise that we have gone a few minutes over time. It is important for us before we leave to reflect on what it is that we will do when we leave this session. And I again ask you to think of how it is that you will practice your own self-care at the end of today. Continuing professional development is one way to continue your growth and knowledge in this area. Accessing sites such as the Centre of Courage and Renewal, the Gottman Institute, and Blue Knot are just a few that we recommend. Redefining your boundaries, both personally and professionally, is also a really good recommendation. Identifying how it is that we work in this area, how this work makes you feel, attending professional supervision sessions to discuss these thoughts and feelings, and also taking meaningful pauses and breaks from work to be able to say guilt-free no's and to revisit boundaries when we can. Think and act positively. In a world where trauma is all too common, think about how it is that you can be a shining light, not only for yourself, but also for other people. One must keep moving forward, trying not to become too stuck in the story or the experience. We need to be the master of our own destiny and taking steps to be the best version of ourselves that we can. We will include this transcript as well as a whole bunch of resources as part of the follow-up email that is sent out to you following this session today. We'll include the trauma-informed fact sheet as part of the Play Safe program, which I mentioned earlier, and also links to the trauma-informed Because You Care training. There are so many resources out there. As I said, today was really just an entree to the many main meals, and I hope that you now have an appetite to move forward to better work with our young people in out-of-home care within a trauma-informed practice, addressing their sexual health needs. We all need to support our young people to be the best that they can be. And we thank you so much for joining today and showing that you're willing to take that next step. So on behalf of myself and Caddyshack Project, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you've taken something out of today, and please remember to walk away from today and practice some really good self-care for yourself. Don't hesitate to email us with any questions that you have. And as always, we're more than happy to take on any feedback or comments from today's session. So again, from the team, thank you very much. Have a great day and look after yourselves.